Hello, my dear friends, and welcome back to our fireside of mysteries. Tonight, we travel to a quiet corner of Hampshire, where snow lies thick upon the hedgerows, and a single rare flower is about to bloom, the winter rose. For 20 years, it has opened its petals only once a year, in the very depths of winter, and for 20 years, old friends have gathered at Thornfield Grange to witness it. But this year, beauty will not be the only thing that blooms in that quiet greenhouse. Among old friendships, old secrets, and old grudges long buried beneath polite conversation, something far darker waits to unfold. For even the purest flower, my dears, can hide the deadliest intent. Hercule Poirot did not come to Thornfield Grange to solve a murder. He came, as an old friend, simply to see a flower bloom. Now then, let us begin. Arrival at Thornfield Grange. I have observed, over the many years of my friendship with Hercule Poirot, that the man who prided himself on order, symmetry, and the strict avoidance of anything so vulgar as an English winter should have consented, with something approaching enthusiasm, to spend a week in the depths of a Hampshire December. But then, he had known Eleanor Vane a very long time, longer, I believe, than he had known me. And there are certain invitations, it seems, that even the great Hercule Poirot cannot bring himself to decline. "You are certain, Poirot," I said, as our train rattled through a landscape gone entirely white, "that this is not simply an excuse to eat well over Christmas?" He gave me a look of wounded dignity, tugging at his moustaches with gloved fingers. "Hastings, mon ami, I do not require an excuse to eat well. I require only a good chef, and Madame Vane, I am assured, has retained the same excellent cook for 11 years. He paused, and something flickered behind his sharp eyes. Not quite sadness, but its cousin. "No, I go because she has asked me, and because, this year, the rose will bloom." "The rose? Ah, Hastings, you have not heard of the Thornfield rose." He seemed almost affronted by my ignorance. "It is a curiosity, a hybrid, cultivated by Eleanor's late husband some 20 years ago, in the greenhouse at Thornfield Grange. It flowers but once each year, always in December, always at night, and always for one evening only. The family calls it the winter rose. Each year, Eleanor gathers her oldest friends to see it open. It is, I am told, a most beautiful thing. I confess, I thought little more of it. A flower is, after all, a flower, however rare, and my thoughts were occupied chiefly with the question of whether Thornfield Grange possessed central heating. It did not. We arrived a little after 4, the light already fading to that peculiar blue-grey of an English winter afternoon, and the house rose before us like something from an old woodcut. Grey stone, high gables, ivy gone black and leafless against the walls, and smoke curling from no fewer than 6 chimneys. A manservant met us at the door, an elderly stooped fellow named Digby, who informed us, with the weary courtesy of one who has said the same words many times that day, that Mrs. Vane was expecting us in the drawing-room. Eleanor Vane was, I should say, a woman of perhaps 60 years, though she carried herself with the straight-backed grace of someone considerably younger. She rose to greet us with both hands extended, first to Poirot, then to myself, and there was in her face, I noticed this even then, though I confess I thought nothing of it at the time, a kind of brightness that seemed held in place by some effort of will, like a lamp burning a little too steadily against a draught. "Hercule, Captain Hastings, how very good of you both to come all this way in such weather." Her voice was warm, cultured, faintly amused. "You will forgive me if I do not apologize for the cold. Thornfield has never been what one would call a warm house, in any sense of the word." "Madame," said Poirot, bowing over her hand with that particular gallantry he reserved for ladies of a certain refinement, "for you, I would endure a Siberian winter." "You may yet have to," she said, with a small, dry laugh, and gestured us toward the fire, where 3 others already sat. I will set down here, for the sake of clarity, the guests assembled that week at Thornfield Grange, for in time, each of them would matter a very great deal. There was Colonel Gerald Ashworth, a heavy, red-faced man of military bearing, who had known Eleanor's husband in India and had, I gathered, some long financial association with the family since. There was Miss Prudence Latimer, a spinster of perhaps 55, thin and sharp-eyed, who had been, by all accounts, Eleanor's closest friend since their school days, and now lived nearby in the village. There was Mr. Julian Vane, Eleanor's nephew by marriage, a pale young man of 30, with an artist's soft hands and a manner that struck me as somewhat too eager to please. And finally, arriving the following morning by the last train from London, there would be Mrs. Sylvia Wren, a widow of striking beauty, said to have been a great friend of Eleanor's in years gone by, though of that friendship's more particular nature, no one seemed entirely willing to speak. 5 old friends, then, gathered as they had been gathered for 20 Decembers past, to watch a rare flower open in the dark of the greenhouse, and Poirot and I, invited, I now believe, not entirely by accident. It was over sherry, before the fire, that I first noticed it. A certain quality in the room, beneath the pleasantries, like a draught, felt but not seen. Colonel Ashworth laughed a shade too loudly, at nothing in particular. Miss Latimer watched Eleanor with an attention that seemed, to my English sensibilities, almost too close for comfort. And young Julian Vane, when Eleanor's hand brushed his sleeve in passing, flinched, actually flinched, before recovering himself with a smile. Poirot, I am quite certain, noticed all of this and a good deal more besides, though he said nothing at the time, save some pleasant remark about the excellence of the sherry. It was only much later that night, as we retired to our rooms along a corridor lit by a single guttering lamp, that he paused outside my door and said, in a voice pitched low, "Hastings, tell me, did you observe the hands of Madame Vane when she poured the tea this afternoon?" I confessed I had not. "They trembled," said Poirot quietly. "Only a little, but they trembled." He was silent a moment, staring down the dark corridor, as though he might, by will alone, see through its shadows to whatever lay concealed within this quiet, gracious house. "I think, mon ami, that our hostess is a woman carrying something very heavy indeed. I only hope," he added, turning at last toward his own door, "that we are in time to help her put it down." I did not think much of this remark that night. I have had cause, many times since, to remember it. Old friends, older secrets. Morning at Thornfield Grange brought with it a hard, bright frost, and the kind of pale winter sunlight that makes everything look cleaner than it is. I came down to breakfast to find Poirot already at the table, immaculate as ever despite the hour, engaged in what appeared to be a most cordial conversation with Miss Prudence Latimer over the matter of kippers. "Captain Hastings," Miss Latimer inclined her head at me with the brisk economy of a woman who does not waste warmth on strangers until they have proven themselves worthy of it. "Monsieur Poirot has been telling me you were a soldier." "For my sins," I said, taking my seat. "There are worse sins than soldiering," she said, and something in the flatness of her tone made me look at her more closely. She was a thin woman, sharp about the wrists and jaw, dressed in the sort of severe tweed that suggested she had long ago decided fashion was not worth the trouble. But her eyes, when they moved to the window, to the grey shape of the greenhouse just visible across the lawn, held an expression I could not quite place. Longing, perhaps, or something closer to dread. "You have known Mrs. Vane a long time, mademoiselle?" Poirot inquired, buttering his toast with the meticulous care he brought to all things. "Since we were girls, 40 years or near enough." She set down her cup. "We came out the same season, if you can believe such an old-fashioned phrase still means anything. Eleanor was always the beauty. I was always the clever one." A small, dry smile. It answered well enough, for a time. "And Colonel Ashworth? He also is an old friend?" "Gerald came later, through Eleanor's husband. Robert knew him in the army, in India, before I ever met either of them." She paused. "Gerald has always had a talent for attaching himself to people who can be of use to him. I don't say that unkindly. It is simply a fact, like the weather." I thought this a remarkably ungenerous thing to say of a fellow guest at one's breakfast table, but Poirot only nodded, as though she had told him nothing more remarkable than the time of day. It was Colonel Ashworth himself who joined us not 5 minutes later, red-faced and hearty from his morning walk, stamping snow from his boots in the hall with the vigor of a man determined to prove himself younger than his years. "Cold as the devil out there," he announced to the room in general. "But does one good. Eh, Latimer?" Miss Latimer did not reply. If Ashworth noticed the chill in her silence, he gave no sign of it, settling himself instead with a hearty appetite for eggs and an equally hearty account of the pheasant shooting to be had, he assured us, on the estate's northern boundary. Though I noted, with some interest, that Eleanor Vane had not once, in any conversation I had yet heard, mentioned any intention of permitting shooting parties at all. "You have business interests with Mrs. Vane, I understand, Colonel?" Poirot asked, with the air of a man making idle conversation. Ashworth's fork paused, very briefly, over his plate. "Advised her on this and that, since Robert died. Man of the world, you know. Woman alone needs someone to look after the practical side of things." He resumed eating with, I thought, a fraction more speed than before. "Not that Eleanor isn't sharp as a tack herself, but there's things a woman shouldn't have to trouble with." "Naturally," said Poirot smoothly, and said nothing more on the subject, though I saw his eyes rest on the Colonel a moment longer than politeness strictly required. It was young Julian Vane who joined us last, a full half-hour after the others, looking as though he had slept poorly, which, I later learned, he had. He was a slight young man, with the long, restless hands of an artist, and a habit of glancing at doorways as though he expected, at any moment, to be called away to answer for some fault. "Aunt Eleanor's compliments," he said, dropping into his chair. "She's gone to the greenhouse to see to the rose. Says it's showing signs of opening tonight, a full day early, and Mercer's in a state about it." He caught my look of inquiry. "Mercer's the gardener, has been for donkey's years. Takes that rose more seriously than his own children, I shouldn't wonder." "You are fond of your aunt, Monsieur Vane?" Poirot asked. Something crossed the young man's face, quick, and gone before I could properly name it. "Everyone's fond of Aunt Eleanor," he said, a shade too lightly. "She's frightfully good to us all, more than we deserve, some of us." He laughed, but the laugh did not reach his eyes, and he busied himself overlong with his coffee cup. I glanced at Poirot, expecting some sharp follow-up question, but he only murmured something agreeable about the excellence of English breakfasts, and let the moment pass, though I knew him well enough by then to recognize the particular stillness that came over him when he had heard something he intended to remember. We saw Eleanor herself a little before noon, returning from the greenhouse with her cheeks pink from the cold and a look of quiet excitement that made her, for a moment, seem 20 years younger. "It will open tonight," she told us, drawing off her gloves by the fire. "Mercer says he's never known it a day early in 20 years, but there it is. I confess I'm rather glad. It means Sylvia will be here to see it, at least." A shadow crossed her face, there and gone. "She was so very fond of it, you know. In the old days." "Mrs. Wren arrives this afternoon?" I asked. "On the 4 o'clock train. Julian's driving to fetch her." Eleanor's eyes moved, very briefly, to her nephew, who had gone quite still over his newspaper. "It will be good to have us all together again. It has been rather too long." There was a silence then, brief but distinct, the kind of silence that falls not from an absence of things to say, but from too many things unsaid. And I confess that even I, no great student of human subtlety, felt the weight of it pressing against the pleasant warmth of the fire. It was Poirot who broke it, rising with a small bow. "Then I shall look forward, madame, to an evening among old friends, and to a rose that has waited 20 years to make my acquaintance." Eleanor smiled at him, a real smile, this time warm and unguarded, and for a moment the strange tension in the room seemed to lift entirely. But later, walking with me along the frozen path toward the greenhouse, where a thin, anxious man I took to be Mercer the gardener stood fussing over some instrument of glass and brass beside a single, extraordinary bloom of deep, blood-dark red, Poirot said quietly, "5 old friends, Hastings, gathered in one house, and not one of them, I think entirely glad to see the others." He stopped before the greenhouse glass, regarding the rose within with an expression I could not quite read. "It is a beautiful thing, is it not? And yet Mercer will not permit me to enter without gloves, for he says the sap of the stem, if it touches broken skin, can make a man very ill indeed." He turned to me, and there was something grave beneath the lightness of his tone. "A rose that can kill, mon ami, kept for 20 years in the house of a woman guarding some old and heavy secret. I think perhaps we should watch tonight rather more closely than we drink." I did not at the time think he meant this literally. I have had cause since to wish I had listened rather more carefully. The night the rose opened, Mrs. Sylvia Wren arrived a little after 5, and I understood, within moments of her stepping into the drawing room, why so much had been left carefully unsaid in the 2 days preceding her arrival. She was, even now, a remarkably beautiful woman, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of composed, watchful beauty that seems to invite conversation while somehow discouraging it at the same time. She crossed the room to Eleanor, with both hands outstretched, and the two women embraced, with every appearance of genuine warmth. "Eleanor, you look well, better than well." Mrs. Wren held her at arm's length, studying her with an odd, searching look. "It has been too long." "6 years," said Eleanor quietly. "Not since Robert's funeral." "6 years," Mrs. Wren repeated, and something passed between the two women then, swift, private, gone before I could properly read it, before Sylvia Wren turned, with a smile of practiced brilliance, to be introduced to the rest of us. I noticed, as introductions were made round the room, that Colonel Ashworth greeted her with a stiffness quite unlike his usual bluff heartiness, and that Miss Latimer did not rise from her chair at all, offering only a thin, tight smile that did not extend to her eyes. Julian Vane, who had driven her from the station, hovered near the door with the anxious energy of a man who has spent 40 minutes in a motor car with someone he would very much rather have avoided. Poirot, for his part, bowed over Mrs. Wren's hand with all his customary gallantry, though I saw his eyes move once, quickly, around the room, cataloguing, as was his habit, every flicker of expression that the lady's arrival had provoked. Dinner that evening was, on the surface, a merry affair. Eleanor had ordered champagne, in honor, she said, of the rose's early blooming, and there was a great deal of determined conversation about old times, house parties from decades past, a memorable New Year at Robert Vane's family seat in Yorkshire, a scandal involving someone's disgraced cousin that had, apparently, once set the whole county talking. And yet, beneath the laughter, I felt again that peculiar draught I had noticed on our first evening. Glances exchanged, and quickly withdrawn, a silence that fell whenever Sylvia Wren spoke too long on any one subject, a certain watchfulness in Eleanor's eyes whenever she looked from one guest to another, as though she were counting something, or perhaps guarding against some reckoning she alone anticipated. It was near 10 o'clock when Mercer the gardener appeared at the drawing-room door, cap in hand, to announce, with the solemnity of a man reporting a birth, that the rose was opening. We went out together, all 7 of us, wrapped in coats against the bitter cold, along the frozen gravel path to the greenhouse, where Mercer had lit a small oil lamp beside the bloom. I confess the sight, when we crowded close about the glass, was worth the cold. The great dark red flower had unfurled itself fully now, its petals thick and glossy as poured wax, and it gave off a scent, faint but unmistakable, of something sweet and slightly bitter beneath, like almonds left too long in a warm room. 20 years, Eleanor murmured, gazing at it, and it is more beautiful each time. She turned to the others, and there was something almost pleading in her voice. Robert planted the first cutting the year we were married. He always said it bloomed for me. "It is a pity," said Miss Latimer, very quietly, "that some things which bloom so beautifully should be so dangerous underneath." There was a silence at this, brief but so complete that I heard, quite clearly, the small hiss of the oil lamp beside us. Eleanor's face, in that flickering light, went very still. "Prudence," she said softly, "must you always find the shadow in the loveliest things?" "I find," said Miss Latimer, in the same quiet voice, "that shadows have a way of finding us whether we look for them or not." Colonel Ashworth laughed too loudly into the silence that followed, declared it far too cold to stand about admiring shrubbery, however remarkable, and proposed we return to the fire and the remainder of the champagne, a proposal seconded with visible relief by nearly everyone present. It was agreed that a small measure of celebration was in order, and Digby was dispatched to prepare a final round of drinks before the household retired. "A particular family tradition," Eleanor explained. "A warm, spiced wine she had made each year since Robert's death, poured from a single silver jug and served to the assembled company as a kind of toast to the rose and to old friendship." I recall little of the conversation that followed, the pleasant, unremarkable talk of people growing comfortably tired after a long day, save that Eleanor herself proposed the toast, raising her glass with something of her earlier brightness restored. "To old friends," she said, "and to the courage it takes to remain them." We drank. I thought nothing of the strange particularity of her toast until very much later. Eleanor retired first, a little before midnight, kissing Miss Latimer's cheek and pressing Sylvia Wren's hand with what seemed to me real affection, before mounting the stairs with her candle, moving, I thought, a little more slowly than was her habit. The rest of us followed within the half hour, the house settling into that particular silence that only old houses in deep winter seem to possess. I was woken, I judge, somewhere near 6 in the morning, by the sound of screaming. It was Eleanor's maid, a young woman named Ivy, who had gone in with the morning tea to find her mistress lying quite still upon her bed, fully dressed as she had retired, her face turned toward the window, as though she had been looking out, in her last moments, at the frozen garden and the dark shape of the greenhouse beyond. Poirot was at my door before I had properly gathered my wits, already dressed, his face grave in a way I had rarely seen it. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly. "I fear our hostess will not be joining us for breakfast." We found Dr. Wilkins, the local physician, hastily summoned, already bent over the bed when we entered, and I saw at once, from the particular stiffness of Poirot's bearing beside me, that whatever the doctor was about to say, my friend had already, in some part of his mind, anticipated it. "Hard at a guess," said Wilkins, straightening, "though I confess I don't much care for the look of her lips, nor the smell in this room." He glanced toward the small glass of spiced wine, half finished, still standing on the nightstand, where Eleanor had evidently taken it up to her room the night before. "Bitter almonds, or I'm a Dutchman. I'd not touch that glass, if I were you, gentlemen, not until we know a good deal more than we do now." Poirot moved to the nightstand, and stood a long moment looking down at the glass, at the still, pale face of Eleanor Vane, and, I noticed only then, at a single dark red petal, fallen from some bloom I did not at first recognize, lying upon the coverlet beside her hand. "Mon Dieu," he said softly, and there was in his voice a depth of feeling I had rarely heard him permit himself before a case had even properly begun. She knew, Hastings. I think, God help her, she knew. The little grey cells awaken. There is a particular transformation that comes over Hercule Poirot at the outset of an investigation, and I had witnessed it many times before, and yet it never failed to strike me afresh. The grief that had, for one unguarded moment, softened his face beside Eleanor Vane's bed was folded away, as neatly as a handkerchief returned to a pocket, and in its place came a stillness, a precision, a quality of attention that seemed almost to alter the temperature of the room. "Dr. Wilkins," he said, "you will forgive me. I must ask that nothing in this room be touched until the proper authorities arrive. The glass, in particular, must be preserved exactly as it stands." "Quite right," said Wilkins, though he looked a little affronted, as country doctors often do, at being told his own business by a foreigner in a dressing gown. "I've sent the boy for Inspector Reeves already. He'll want a word with all of you. I shouldn't wonder." Naturally. Poirot's eyes moved once more about the room, the neat, feminine furnishings, the small writing desk by the window with its blotter and stack of correspondence, the wardrobe standing slightly ajar, the single red petal upon the coverlet. "Tell me, Doctor, in your professional opinion, how long ago did death occur?" Wilkins considered. "Some hours. Body's quite cold. I should say between 1 and 3 in the morning, though I'll not commit to closer than that without a proper examination. And the smell you noted, of bitter almonds. You are confident of it." "Confident enough to say I don't like it," said Wilkins shortly. "Cyanide has that smell, as any medical man knows, though I'll tell you plainly, Monsieur Poirot, I've practiced in this county 30 years and never once had cause to test for it. If it is what I think it is, someone in this house has done a very wicked thing indeed." Poirot nodded slowly and moved at last to the writing desk, where he stood a long moment looking down at the scattered papers, not touching them, merely observing, in the manner of a man committing a photograph to memory. "Hastings," he said quietly, "you will note the position of the chair. It is drawn back from the desk, as though Madame Vane rose from it in some haste or under some agitation, and did not think to push it in again. A small thing. But Madame Vane, I think, was not a careless woman. I looked and saw that he was right. The chair stood at an awkward angle, quite unlike the careful order of the rest of the room. You think she was writing something?" "I think," said Poirot, "that we shall know a great deal more once Inspector Reeves permits us to examine that blotter properly. For now," he turned from the desk with visible reluctance, "we must go down and speak with the household, before grief and fear have had time to arrange itself into convenient stories." Inspector Reeves arrived within the hour, a stolid, unhurried man of perhaps 45, with the deliberate manner of a policeman who has learned, through long experience, that haste solves fewer cases than patience. He greeted Poirot with the particular wariness that provincial policemen so often extend toward the famous Belgian detective, respectful, but not entirely willing to be managed. "Monsieur Poirot, I've heard of you, of course." He did not sound especially delighted by the association. "This is a bad business. A very bad business. I understand you were a guest in this house." "I was, Inspector, an old friend of Madame Vane, invited to witness the blooming of her rose. I confess, I did not anticipate that I should instead be called upon to investigate her death." Reeves grunted, non-committal, and set about his own methodical examination of the room, while Poirot, with that particular tact he reserved for policemen, whose cooperation he required, offered his observations only when asked, and asked, in turn, only the questions that seemed, on the surface, most innocent. It was the doctor's preliminary examination, conducted that same morning, that confirmed what Wilkins had already suspected: cyanide, almost certainly administered in the spiced wine, in a quantity sufficient to cause death within perhaps 20 minutes of consumption. 20 minutes, Poirot repeated thoughtfully, when Reeves conveyed this information to us in the small morning room that had been given over as a temporary headquarters for the investigation. Madame Vane retired a little before midnight. If she drank from the glass shortly after reaching her room, then death would have occurred somewhere near 20 minutes past. And yet Dr. Wilkins places the time of death rather later, between 1 and 3. "Perhaps she didn't drink it straight away," I suggested. "Perhaps she sat up a while first." "Writing, as you said." "Perhaps," said Poirot, though his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied. "Or perhaps, mon ami, the poison was not in the wine at all when she first raised the glass to her lips, but was introduced to it rather later in the evening, after she had already retired." Reeves looked up sharply at this. "You're suggesting someone entered her room in the night." "I am suggesting nothing, Inspector, beyond the observation that the timing does not, as yet, quite fit together as neatly as we should like. It is early days. We must gather the threads before we may hope to see the pattern they make." Poirot folded his hands upon the table before him, and I recognized, in the particular stillness of his posture, that he had already begun, in his own mind, the long and careful work of untangling those threads. "Now, I think it is time, Inspector, that we spoke with the household, beginning, I think, with the silver jug from which the wine was poured, and with whoever had occasion to handle it last. That person, as it transpired, was Digby, the elderly manservant, who was summoned to the morning room, looking grey with shock, and something very like fear. "I poured it myself, sir," he said, to Reeves's careful questioning. "Same as every year. Filled the jug in the kitchen, from the pot Mrs. Bell had mulling on the stove since supper, and carried it through to the drawing-room myself, on the tray, with the 7 glasses. And the jug stood where? Before it was poured? On the sideboard in the drawing-room, sir, from about 9:30, so as everyone might help themselves through the evening, and the last of it poured fresh and warm for the toast, as is the custom. Then the jug stood unattended on the sideboard for some considerable time. Digby's face, already pale, went a shade paler still. I suppose it did, sir. I couldn't say I watched it every moment. There was a deal of coming and going, what with the rose opening, and everyone in and out to the greenhouse." Poirot's eyes met mine across the table, and I understood, without a word being spoken, precisely what he was thinking. That for the better part of 2 hours, upon a bitter December evening, while the household's attention was fixed upon a blooming flower in a frozen greenhouse, a jug of warm spiced wine had stood entirely unwatched upon a drawing-room sideboard, and that any one of the 5 old friends gathered beneath that roof might, with very little difficulty, have slipped something into it unseen. "Merci, Digby," said Poirot gently. "You have been most helpful. One thing more, if you would be so good. Who among the guests left the drawing-room, even briefly, during that evening, before the rose was announced?" Digby considered, his brow furrowed, with the effort of an honest man, determined to be accurate. "Colonel Ashworth went out for a cigar on the terrace, sir, some while before dinner was properly over. Mr. Julian went up to fetch a shawl for his aunt, she having felt a chill. And Mrs. Wren—" he hesitated, just perceptibly. "Mrs. Wren was gone from the room a good 20 minutes, sir, before the rose was announced." "I couldn't say where." Poirot's gaze sharpened very slightly at this last piece of information, though his voice remained perfectly mild. 20 minutes, you say? That is a very precise figure for a man who was, presumably, occupied with his own duties. "I noticed it particular, sir," said Digby, with the first flicker of something like personal opinion crossing his careful servant's composure, "because Mrs. Vane asked after her twice, and seemed, if you'll forgive me saying so, sir, seemed uneasy that she didn't come." When Digby had gone, Poirot sat a long moment in silence, his fingers steepled before him, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window where, I knew, the greenhouse stood grey and silent in the winter light. 20 minutes unaccounted for, Hastings," he said at last. "On the very night, a jug of wine stood unwatched upon a sideboard. It is, perhaps, nothing at all. Many innocent things take 20 minutes to accomplish." He rose, smoothing his waistcoat with characteristic precision. "But I think, mon ami, that it is time we had a rather more particular conversation with Madame Wren, and I think, moreover, that we should ask her before Inspector Reeves has the opportunity to do so in his own rather less delicate fashion. There are questions a policeman may ask that provoke only silence, and questions an old friend may ask that provoke, sometimes, the truth. What old friends do not say. We found Sylvia Wren alone in the small library, seated by the window with a book unopened in her lap, staring out at the frozen garden with an expression of such profound stillness that I hesitated a moment before Poirot, with characteristic lack of ceremony, knocked and entered regardless. "Madame Wren, you will forgive the intrusion. I wonder if I might beg a few moments of your time." She looked up, and I saw that her eyes were red-rimmed, though her composure, when she spoke, was perfectly steady. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. I imagine you have a great many questions for all of us." "A few," said Poirot, settling himself into the chair opposite with the unhurried ease of a man merely paying a social call. "Tell me, madame, how long had you known Eleanor Vane?" "Since we were 17, nearly 40 years. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "We came out the same season as Prudence. The 3 of us were quite inseparable in those days. I don't suppose you'd believe it, to see us now. Friendships change with time. It is the way of things. But I wonder, madame, whether yours and Madame Vane's changed rather more than most." Poirot's voice remained perfectly gentle, and yet I saw Sylvia Wren's hands tighten, very slightly, upon the closed book in her lap. "You have not visited Thornfield Grange in 6 years, I am told. Since Monsieur Vane's funeral. That is a very long absence, for a friendship of 40 years standing." For a long moment, she said nothing at all, and I thought she might refuse to answer entirely. Then, quite suddenly, something in her seemed to give way. "You will hear it from someone, I suppose, if not from me, and better, perhaps, that you hear it plainly." She set the book aside and folded her hands. "Robert Vane and I were in love, Monsieur Poirot, many years ago, before either of us married anyone else. It came to nothing. He chose Eleanor, and rightly so, for she loved him a great deal more steadily than ever I could have managed. But love of that sort does not always die simply because it is inconvenient. And there was a time, some years into their marriage, when Robert and I were rather less careful than we ought to have been." "An affair," said Poirot, without inflection. "A brief one, very brief, and long ago. Eleanor discovered it, as wives so often do, and I truly believed, Monsieur Poirot, that she had never forgiven me, though she was far too well-bred ever to say so outright. We maintained the appearance of friendship for Robert's sake, and later, after he died, I thought it kinder to us both to let the friendship lapse quietly." Her voice trembled, very slightly. "When Eleanor wrote to me last month, asking me to come this year particularly, I very nearly refused. I came because I thought, perhaps foolishly, that she meant to finally forgive me, that this might be the year we set it right at last." "And did you set it right?" Sylvia Wren's eyes filled, quite suddenly, with tears. "I never had the chance. We spoke a little. The evening I arrived, she was warm, warmer than I had dared hope. But there was no time, Monsieur Poirot, no time at all, before she stopped, unable to continue." "Digby tells us," said Poirot gently, "that you were absent from the drawing-room for some 20 minutes on the evening the rose bloomed, before its opening was announced. Might I ask where you were, madame?" She looked up at him, startled, and something like fear flickered across her face before she mastered it. "I went to the greenhouse, alone. I wished to see the rose before the others. Robert planted it the year he and I—" She stopped again, coloured, and pressed on. "I wished a private moment with it, that is all. Mercer was there, tending it. He can confirm it, if you doubt me." "I do not doubt you, madame," said Poirot, with a small, courteous bow of the head that I could not tell was entirely sincere. "I merely gather the threads. Merci, Madame Wren. You have been most helpful." We left her there, by the window, and once we were safely in the corridor beyond, I turned to Poirot with some impatience. "Well, do you believe her?" "I believe," said Poirot slowly, "that she has told us the truth about the affair, because it is precisely the sort of truth that a guilty woman would not volunteer so readily. It does her no credit, and yet she offered it unprompted. But whether she has told us the whole truth about those 20 minutes in the greenhouse—" He shook his head. "That, Hastings, we must verify with Mercer before I permit myself to believe it entirely. We found the gardener in his cottage near the walled garden, a thin, anxious man who seemed almost relieved to have company, however grim the occasion. Mrs. Wren come to the greenhouse that evening, right enough," Mercer confirmed, when Poirot put the question to him. "Come in quiet, stood looking at the rose a good while. Didn't say much. I remember thinking she looked fair upset about something, but I didn't like to ask." He hesitated. "There was another came by too, sir, round about the same time, though I don't know as it means anything." Poirot went very still. "Another, Monsieur Mercer?" "Mr. Julian, sir. Come to the greenhouse door, saw Mrs. Wren was there already, and went off again quick without coming in. Looked put out about it, if you take my meaning. Like he'd wanted a private word with the rose himself, and found someone there before him. And this was before or after Colonel Ashworth's cigar upon the terrace?" Mercer scratched his head. "Couldn't rightly say, sir. I weren't watching the terrace." Poirot thanked him with grave courtesy, and we walked back toward the house, in a silence that I, for one, found increasingly oppressive. "Julian Vane wished a private moment with the rose also," I said at last. "That is curious, is it not?" "Very curious," Poirot agreed. A young man who flinches when his aunt's hand brushes his sleeve, who cannot meet her eye at breakfast, who wished, for reasons of his own, a private audience with a flower his uncle planted 20 years before his own birth into this family's affairs. He shook his head slowly. I think, Hastings, it is time we spoke with young Monsieur Vane. But I confess, and here, for the first time since the investigation had begun, I heard in his voice something that might almost have been described as uncertainty. I confess, I do not yet see the shape of this puzzle, though I begin to suspect it possesses a great many more pieces than 5 old friends gathered in one house. We found Julian Vane, as it happened, in the greenhouse itself, standing before the great dark rose, now beginning, I noticed, to wilt at its edges, with an expression of such raw and private grief that I felt, for a moment, as though we had intruded upon something we had no right to witness. Monsieur Vane, said Poirot quietly from the doorway, a word, if you would be so kind. Julian turned, and I saw that his eyes were wet, and that his hands, when he thrust them into his pockets, trembled visibly. You've come to ask about the greenhouse, he said, before Poirot could speak. About that evening. I know Mercer will have told you I was here. He laughed, a short, unhappy sound. I don't suppose there's much use in denying it. None whatsoever, Poirot agreed pleasantly, since I do not yet know what it is you might wish to deny. Suppose, monsieur, you simply tell me the truth, and save us both a great deal of trouble. Julian Vane looked at him a long moment, and then, quite suddenly, sat down heavily upon an overturned flower pot, and put his face in his hands. I owe money, Monsieur Poirot, he said, muffled. A great deal of money. Gambling debts, foolish, stupid debts, run up in London over 2 years, until I hardly know how deep the hole runs any longer. I came to the greenhouse that night to work up the courage to ask my aunt for help. Again. I have asked her twice before, and each time she has helped me, and each time I have promised her it was the last, and each time— He stopped, shaking his head. I could not face asking her a third time. I went to the greenhouse to think, and found Mrs. Wren already there, and lost my nerve entirely, and went away again, without asking anything at all. And did you ask her? Later that evening. Julian looked up, his face wretched. No, I never got the chance. And now she is dead, and I never will, and half the county will say I killed her for the very money I never had the courage to ask her for while she lived. He gave a bitter, broken laugh. You must see how that looks, Monsieur Poirot. I hardly need you to point it out to me. Poirot regarded the young man for a long moment, and I saw in his face an expression I recognized well, the particular, careful stillness of a detective weighing a confession against the shape of the evidence, and finding, as yet, no place where the two pieces fit cleanly together. I see a young man in a great deal of trouble, he said at last, not unkindly, which is not, Monsieur Vane, quite the same thing as seeing a murderer. But I will tell you this quite plainly. It would go very much better for you if there was some way to confirm where you went and what you did in the hour before your aunt retired to her room. Think carefully. It may matter a very great deal. We left him there among the wilting roses and walked back to the house in a silence heavier than before. 2 of our 5 old friends, I said at last, each with a private and rather damning reason to have wished Eleanor Vane out of the way of some unwelcome truth. 2, Poirot agreed, and I begin to suspect, Hastings, that we shall find similar unhappy little secrets beneath the composure of Colonel Ashworth and Mademoiselle Latimer also, before this day is done. It is the great difficulty of investigating among old friends. Everyone, without exception, has something to hide, and very rarely is it the thing for which they hang. A theory too neatly made. By that afternoon, Poirot had gathered, in the manner of a man collecting stray threads before a great tapestry, a considerable quantity of small and unhappy facts. Colonel Ashworth, when pressed, and pressed rather harder than the others, for he was not a man inclined to volunteer anything he was not obliged to, admitted at last, with a great show of reluctance, that his business advice to Eleanor Vane over the preceding 6 years had, in point of fact, involved the management of a rather substantial sum of her late husband's money, a sum which he had, by his own account, invested with somewhat more enthusiasm than success.
Lost a fair bit of it, he admitted gruffly, when Poirot's questions had at last worn through his bluster. In a mining venture, 3 years back. Eleanor never knew the whole of it. I've been making it good, bit by bit, out of my own pocket, these last 2 years, and would have finished the job entirely within the 12-month, had she only— He stopped, and had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable. Well, it doesn't look well for me, does it, Monsieur Poirot, put so plainly. Woman trusted me with her husband's money, and I made a hash of a good chunk of it. But I'll tell you straight, I'd no reason on God's earth to want her dead. Quite the opposite. Dead women don't forgive debts, Monsieur Poirot. They call in executors, and executors go through the books rather more thoroughly than grieving widows ever do. It was, Poirot admitted to me afterward, not an unreasonable point. Miss Latimer, when her turn came, proved rather harder to draw out, answering Poirot's careful questions with the guarded precision of a woman long practiced in giving away exactly as much as she chose, and not one word more. You ask whether I had reason to wish Eleanor harm, she said at last, in the small sitting room where the interview took place. I will tell you the truth, Monsieur Poirot, since I don't suppose it will remain hidden long in any case. I have loved Eleanor Vane the whole of my life, not as a friend loves a friend, but as I dare say you may already have guessed, given the delicacy with which you have avoided asking the question outright. Her chin lifted, defiant. I never told her, never once, in 40 years. It would have cost me the only real friendship I have ever had, and I judged the cost too high. But watching her forgive Sylvia everything, Sylvia who took Robert from her, if only for a season, and was welcomed back into this house as though nothing at all had happened, while I gave 40 years of silent devotion and received, in return, nothing more than the ordinary affection one extends to any old friend. She stopped, her composure cracking, just slightly, at the edges. You may draw whatever conclusion you please from that, Monsieur Poirot. I did not kill her, but I will not pretend the last 40 years have not, at times, been a very particular kind of misery. Poirot, when at last we retired that evening to compare notes over a small glass of brandy by the fire, was unusually quiet. 4 old friends, Hastings, he said at last, each carrying a private grief or grievance sufficient, on the surface, to furnish a motive for murder. Julian and his debts, Sylvia and her old betrayal, never quite forgiven, Ashworth and his mismanaged fortune, Prudence and her 40 years of silent, unrequited devotion. He shook his head slowly. It is, on the surface, a very satisfying arrangement of motives. Almost too satisfying, I think. You suspect one of them in particular? Poirot hesitated, and it was this hesitation, more than anything he said that evening, which I remember most clearly in light of what followed. I confess, mon ami, that my instinct inclines me toward young Julian Vane. He tapped the arm of his chair with one manicured finger. Consider, he alone, of the 4, stood to gain immediately and materially from his aunt's death, being, as Digby has confirmed to me this afternoon, the principal beneficiary of her will. He alone was seen near the greenhouse, with no satisfactory account of his purpose there. And he alone, when questioned, offered an explanation so wretched and self-condemning that I confess I wondered, even as he spoke it, whether a guilty man might not choose precisely such a confession, humiliating, but not fatal, in order to forestall a far more damaging truth. You think he's lying? I think, said Poirot slowly, that a young man drowning in gambling debts, who stood to inherit a fortune sufficient to clear them entirely, who was seen loitering near the means of poison on the very night of the murder, presents a case that Inspector Reeves will find a good deal more persuasive than any of the others. I confess, Hastings, that I find myself rather persuaded also. He sighed, and for a moment looked almost weary. I have asked Reeves to hold him for further questioning tomorrow morning, pending the results of the post-mortem examination. I record here, with the particular discomfort of a man setting down his friend's error for posterity, that this was, as it transpired, a mistake, and one which Poirot himself would come, within a day, to regret very deeply. For that night, While the household lay uneasy in its beds and Inspector Reeves's constable kept a watchful eye upon young Julian Vane's door, a second, and altogether more terrible thing occurred at Thornfield Grange, one which would prove, beyond any doubt, that whatever dark hand had poisoned Eleanor Vane's spiced wine, it had not yet finished its work. I woke, near 2 in the morning, to the sound of Poirot's urgent knocking upon my door. "Hastings, get up, quickly! There has been another." The truth beneath the rose. I have rarely dressed so quickly in my life. Poirot stood in the corridor, candle in hand, his face grave in the flickering light, and led me at a swift pace toward the east wing, where a small knot of frightened servants had already gathered outside a door I recognized, with a lurch of the stomach, as belonging to Miss Prudence Latimer. She lay upon her bed much as Eleanor had lain, fully dressed, quite still, a small empty glass overturned upon the nightstand beside her. But she was not, I saw with considerable relief, dead. Dr. Wilkins, hastily roused a second time, was already bent over her, and looked up as we entered with an expression of grim satisfaction, quite unlike the grief of 2 mornings before. "She'll live, I think, thank God. Whoever dosed this glass was either careless with the measure or lost their nerve halfway through. I've given her something to bring it back up, and I believe we've caught it in time." He straightened, wiping his hands. "But make no mistake, gentlemen, this was the same poison, or I'm no doctor at all." Poirot moved at once to the nightstand, and stood looking down at the glass with an expression I had rarely seen him wear, something between fury and profound self-reproach. "I have made an error, Hastings," he said quietly. "A most grave and inexcusable error. I permitted the shape of the evidence to persuade me before I had properly tested it, and in doing so, I placed an innocent young man under suspicion, while the true danger in this house continued, quite unchecked, to walk its corridors at night." He turned to me, and there was something almost bleak in his eyes. "Julian Vane has been in a locked room, under Reeves's own constable's watch, since 8 o'clock this evening. He cannot have done this, which means, mon ami, that I was wrong, entirely and dangerously wrong, and a second woman very nearly died for my error. It was, I confess, one of the very few occasions upon which I saw Hercule Poirot genuinely shaken by his own fallibility, and I own I did not know quite what to say to comfort him, beyond observing that Miss Latimer, at least, yet lived, and that an error caught in time was rather better than one discovered too late. You are kind, Hastings, but kindness does not undo carelessness." He straightened, and something of his old precision returned to his bearing, hardened now by the particular determination of a man who has been humbled and means to make amends. "Come, if Miss Latimer is able to speak, however briefly, we must hear what she recalls before whatever courage brought our poisoner to strike a second time has entirely deserted them." Miss Latimer, when roused sufficiently to speak, could tell us little of substance. She had retired, she said, and taken a small glass of the remaining spiced wine, kept warm upon a spirit lamp in her room by her own request, as she had done every night of her visit, being fond of it and finding it settled her nerves before sleep. She had noticed nothing amiss, save a faintly bitter aftertaste she had put down to the lamp having burned the wine somewhat. "The spirit lamp," Poirot repeated slowly, when we had left her to rest under Wilkins's watchful eye. "Hastings, do you understand what this means?" I confessed I did not. "It means the poison was not, after all, placed in the jug upon the sideboard, to be drunk by whichever unlucky guest happened to take a glass. That theory, plausible as it seemed, cannot now be sustained, for if it were true, the jug would have been emptied and washed 2 days ago, and could not have poisoned Miss Latimer tonight." He began to pace, a habit he permitted himself only when the little grey cells were working at their utmost. "No, the poison, I think, was introduced separately, and more than once, by someone with continued access to Miss Latimer's private supply of the wine, someone who knew she kept it warming in her room each night, and who struck at her a second time, days after the first murder, when suspicion had already, thanks to my own foolishness, settled elsewhere." "But who would wish Prudence Latimer dead?" I asked. "She seemed to me the least likely of anyone.
A woman who loved Eleanor faithfully for 40 years, with nothing to gain from her death at all. Nothing to gain from Eleanor's death, perhaps, Poirot agreed. But consider, Hastings, what if Miss Latimer's danger lies not in what she gained from the first murder, but in what she knows of it? What if, in the days since Eleanor's death, she said something, perhaps without even realizing its significance, that revealed to the true murderer that she had seen, or guessed, something dangerous? He stopped his pacing abruptly, and I saw understanding dawn across his face like sunrise. "The toast," he said suddenly. "Hastings, do you recall Eleanor's toast upon the night she died? To old friends, and to the courage it takes to remain them. A strange thing to say, is it not, for a woman merely celebrating a flower's blooming? And do you recall also what Miss Latimer said beside the greenhouse glass mere hours before, that some things which bloom so beautifully are dangerous underneath, and that shadows have a way of finding us whether we look for them or not? You think she suspected something, even then?" "I think," said Poirot slowly, "that Prudence Latimer, who has watched Eleanor Vane with the particular attentiveness of 40 years' devotion, may have noticed something the rest of us did not. Some small alteration in behavior, some visitor, some private conversation, in the days or weeks before Eleanor's death. I think she did not fully understand its significance until after the murder had already occurred, and I think, in the days since, she has perhaps said something, to the wrong person, at the wrong moment, that revealed she was beginning, dangerously, to understand. Then we must ask her the moment she wakes." "We must," Poirot agreed. "But I think also, Hastings, that we must return to that writing desk in Eleanor's room, and this time examine the blotter with rather more thoroughness than Inspector Reeves's understandable haste permitted. A woman who rises from her desk in agitation on the very night she is murdered has very often been writing something of considerable importance, and I begin to suspect, mon ami, that we have been rather too slow in seeking it out." We obtained Reeves's grudging permission within the hour, and it was Poirot himself, holding the blotting paper up to a lamp and studying its mirrored impressions with the delicate patience of a man reading a language known to very few, who at last gave a soft exclamation of triumph. "Hastings, look here." He held the paper toward me, and though the words were faint and reversed, I could make out, with some effort, a fragment of what Eleanor Vane had been writing on the last night of her life. "Cannot keep silent longer, whatever it costs me now, for Robert's sake and for the child's." "The child's?" I repeated, staring. "Whose child?" "Poirot, what does it mean?" Poirot's face, in the lamplight, had gone very still, and I saw in his eyes the particular brightness of a man who has, at last, glimpsed the true shape of the puzzle beneath the tangle of lesser secrets that had so nearly misled him entirely. "It means, mon ami," he said quietly, "that we have none of us been asking the right question at all. We have asked who had reason to fear exposure of gambling debts, or old affairs, or mismanaged fortunes, small human failings, of the sort that make people unhappy, but rarely make them murderers. We should have asked, from the very first day, a far older and far more dangerous question." He set down the blotting paper with great care, as though it were itself a fragile and precious thing. "We should have asked what happened 20 years ago in this house, at the time, or very near it, that Robert Vane first planted the rose that has bloomed, faithfully, every December since, and what child was born of it, whom Eleanor Vane had kept silent about for 20 years, and had decided, at last, upon the eve of her death, that she could keep silent no longer. The Purest Flower. Poirot said nothing further to me that night, save that we must wait until morning, and that Miss Latimer, in her present weakened state, must be permitted to rest undisturbed. But I saw, in the set of his shoulders as we returned at last to our rooms, that his mind had not rested at all, and I was not in the least surprised, when I woke near 8, to find that he had already been abroad for some hours, and had left instructions that Inspector Reeves and the entire household should assemble in the drawing-room by 10 o'clock precisely. It was a subdued gathering that met there that morning, Sylvia Wren pale and composed by the window,
Colonel Ashworth standing near the fire with the discomfort of a man who dislikes being made to wait upon anything. Julian Vane, released now from the constable's watch, seated a little apart with the wary stillness of a man who has learned, in the space of a single day, exactly how little his own protestations of innocence are worth. Miss Latimer herself, still weak from the night before, had been brought down at her own insistence, wrapped in a shawl, and installed in the chair nearest the fire, where she watched Poirot enter with an expression I could not, even then, entirely read. "Mesdames, messieurs," Poirot began, standing before the cold morning light of the window, "I owe you all, and one of you in particular, a very great apology. 2 days ago, I permitted myself to suspect Monsieur Julian Vane of a crime he did not commit, upon evidence that seemed, at the time, entirely sufficient. I was wrong. I was wrong because I asked the smaller question, who stood to gain, when I ought, from the very first, to have asked the larger one, who had waited longest, and loved longest, and been given, in return, the least." No one spoke. The fire cracked softly in the grate. "I will tell you what I believe happened in this house," Poirot went on, "and you will correct me if I am mistaken. 20 years ago, Robert Vane, some years into a happy marriage, formed an attachment, brief and long regretted, with Madame Wren, then a young friend of the family. From that attachment, a child was born." He paused, and I saw Sylvia Wren's hand fly to her mouth. Eleanor Vane, learning of this, did what I believe very few women could have done. She forgave her husband. And she took the child, for the child's own sake, and for Robert's, and perhaps also, I think, for her own, and raised him as her nephew, that no scandal should touch him, and that he should want for nothing, though he was not, in truth, related to her by blood at all. Julian Vane had gone entirely white. "You are saying," his voice cracked, "you are saying I am not my father's nephew at all. That I am, that you are Robert Vane's son, monsieur, and Madame Wren's," said Poirot gently, "and that Eleanor Vane loved you as her own for 20 years, keeping the secret at considerable cost to herself, because she believed, I think rightly, that the truth, once known, would cause you pain before it caused you any comfort. But in recent weeks, something changed her mind. Perhaps your debts, Monsieur Vane, and her wish that you know you had another parent, another resource, before your troubles grew any deeper. Perhaps simply the weight of 20 years' silence, grown at last too heavy to carry. Whatever the cause, she resolved, upon the last night of her life, to tell you the truth at last, and she began, that very evening, to write it down." Sylvia Wren was weeping now, silently, her composure entirely gone. Julian stared at her, at his mother, with an expression of such raw and complicated grief that I had to look away. "But someone in this house," Poirot continued, his voice dropping, "could not permit that confession to be made. Someone who had loved Eleanor Vane faithfully for 40 years, in silence, without reward, and who understood, better than anyone, precisely what it would mean for that confession to be spoken aloud. Not merely a scandal revived, but a truth that would bind Sylvia Wren to this family forever, through her son, in a closeness that 40 years of loyal, unspoken devotion had never once earned." Every eye in the room turned, slowly, to Miss Prudence Latimer. She did not flinch. She sat very straight in her chair by the fire, her thin hands folded in her lap, and when she spoke at last, her voice was perfectly calm. "You have no proof, Monsieur Poirot." "I have a little," said Poirot quietly. "I have a small vial, found this morning hidden among the linings of your travelling case, containing a residue which Dr. Wilkins believes, upon preliminary examination, to match the sap of the Thornfield rose. I have Mercer's recollection that you visited the greenhouse alone, on more than one afternoon this past week, on the pretext of admiring the flowers, though you have never, in all his years tending that garden, shown the slightest interest in botany before. And I have this." He drew from his pocket a small, folded scrap of paper. "A note, in your own hand, found in the grate of your bedroom, half burned but not entirely. The beginning, I think, of a letter you began to write and thought better of, in which you attempted, I believe, to explain to yourself, if to no one else, why you had done what you had done. It speaks of 40 years, mademoiselle. It speaks of watching someone else forgiven every sin, and receiving, in return for a lifetime's devotion, only ever a friend's affection, never anything more. Miss Latimer's composure broke. Then, all at once, like ice giving way beneath a weight too long endured. 40 years, she said, and her voice, for the first time, shook. 40 years I loved her, Monsieur Poirot, and never once told her, because I knew what it would cost me, and I judged the cost too high. And I watched her forgive Sylvia everything, and take that woman's child into her own house and raise him as her own, out of love for a husband who had betrayed her, while I, who betrayed her in nothing, who gave her every loyalty a woman can give another, received nothing in return but the ordinary kindness one extends to any old friend. She was weeping now, openly, terribly, when she told me she meant to tell Julian the truth, that she meant to bring Sylvia back into this family forever, through the boy. I could not bear it. I could not bear that Sylvia, who had taken everything from Eleanor and given nothing back but grief, should be rewarded with a child's love for the rest of her days, while I, who had given everything and asked nothing, should be given nothing at all in return. And Miss Latimer's own poisoning, I asked quietly. Was that also? A small dose, said Poirot, carefully measured by a woman who had, by then, made a close study of exactly how much of that poison a body might survive, enough to suggest a second victim, and divert suspicion entirely from herself, at the cost of some hours' genuine suffering, a price, I think, she judged worth paying. He looked at Miss Latimer with an expression that held, I thought, more sorrow than condemnation. It was, mademoiselle, a very clever plan, undone in the end not by any great cleverness of my own, but by the simple, stubborn honesty of a dying woman's final letter, and by an old gardener's memory of who visited his greenhouse and when. Inspector Reeves stepped forward then, and the formalities that followed I shall not set down here, for they belong to the law and not to this account of old friends and older secrets. It was some weeks later, in a London considerably warmer than the Hampshire we had left behind, that Poirot and I called upon Sylvia Wren and her son, for so Julian Vane had asked, with quiet dignity, to be known, in the small house they had taken together, to begin, at long last, the acquaintance that 20 years of silence had denied them. She loved you very much, you know, Sylvia told her son gently, as we took tea by the window. Whatever else is true, she loved you enough to keep the secret 20 years, and loved you enough, in the end, to try to give it up. Julian said nothing, but reached for his mother's hand, and held it, and I saw Poirot watching the two of them with an expression of quiet, unguarded satisfaction that I had rarely seen him permit himself at the close of a case. "It is a strange thing, Hastings," he said to me later, as we walked together through the mild spring afternoon, that the woman who seemed, of all of them, the most innocent, the loyal friend, the faithful confidant, the one who asked nothing and expected nothing, should have carried, beneath that quiet devotion, the deadliest intent of all. But then, mon ami, it is often so. The rose that blooms most modestly hides, sometimes, the sharpest thorn, and the heart that loves most silently is not always, for that silence, the gentlest. He was quiet a moment, watching the ordinary London traffic pass, and then added, with something of his old, dry humour restored, "Which is why, Hastings, I make it my particular business never to trust entirely in appearances, and why I recommend, to you and to anyone else who will listen, that when a woman tells you she has loved faithfully for 40 years and asked nothing in return, you inquire very particularly indeed into precisely what she has, in the silence of those 40 years, quietly resolved to take."